Hello and welcome to this next video in the Infrastructure Provisioning with System Center 2012 R2. My name is Kenan Owens. I'm a Senior Product Manager at Microsoft, focusing on Virtual Machine Manager and how virtualization and how it all fits together to build the private cloud. In this video, we're going to focus on two pieces. We're going to focus on constructing the private cloud as well as management across these clouds. Whether I have on-premises private clouds or service providers, I got to pull them together to provide access to my resources, and by allowing me to access resources both on-premises and in a private cloud or a service provider cloud, I can truly gain the benefits of cloud computing. So we're going to focus on those two pieces today, and we're going to start with focusing on the clouds. So when you think about the different things we talked about in the first video, and that was about compute, storage, and network resources, what we were really focusing on there is how do I get all of these different infrastructure pieces and pull them together so that I can use them for my virtual machines. Well, once I've pulled these resources together, I got to create the cloud. And to do that, I got to take this disparate set of resources of compute, storage, and network resources and pull them together and create this logical abstraction. So I take those resources, I allocate them to one or two or different environments. I pull them together to create these logical sets of resources, whether they're in my data center here, my data center across the country, or in a different part of the world. And from there, I create these different clouds. I create that cloud abstraction above the different resources. Now, cloud gives me a couple of things. It gives me the ability to take different hardware pieces, pull them together, and it also gives me the ability to allocate it out to the different users that are going to be deploying resources on this cloud. So first of all, I can create these clouds with tenants and the VM networks that are going to be running on top of them. These VM networks, as we talked about in the first video, is the ability for me to create isolated multi-tenant environments where my network schema is all assigned and configured by that VM network. And I can create these different clouds for either I can logically create them by location, I can logically create them by function, maybe production, development, or I can create them, if I wanted to, by different business units or groups. Normally, an organization would create them via a type of function, like a production cloud, a development cloud, a gold cloud, a silver cloud, a bronze cloud, that type of thing. Once I've created these clouds, the next thing I can do is I can view inside of that cloud the deployed services or VMs that I've deployed on this cloud. So this area of the Virtual Machine Manager console allows me to see what's been deployed, how it's running, and what tiers are functioning or not, which I can start or stop or move around. The last thing I can do is, because this cloud is an abstraction of the physical resources, I can over-provision these resources. What this means is that I can take a set of servers that maybe today I have 5 servers in a cluster and I want to create a cloud on that cluster. But I know that I have 10 different business units and each one wants 4 terabytes of RAM and 60 terabytes of storage. Well, I can create these multiple clouds for these different units or for my production development environment that actually thinks it's using more resources than what's physically on the servers that are deployed. And I can over-provision them because then when I deploy resources, I can add new physical resources underneath, add them to the cloud, and expand that capacity on the fly without having to mess with the different virtual machines or services that are running inside that cloud. The next thing clouds allow me to do is it allows me to connect to the underlying physical resources. So when I create a new cloud, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be determining which host groups, or if I'm using VMware, which resource pools I want to connect to. And I can choose, do I connect to a bunch of different cloud host groups, or do I just pick individual ones? And I can aggregate those resources together. So if I have a host group that has a cluster in one data center and another cluster in another group of servers in that data center, or maybe even a different data center, I can choose those different host groups and aggregate those resources together to be the full capacity of the resources I'm going to use. I can also then choose the logical networks that are going to be available to run these virtualized environments upon this cloud. And the logical networks, as we talked about in the first video, are the networks that allow me to map that physical resources to the networking infrastructure that I'm going to use for, say, network virtualization, those provider addresses and things like that. That helps me with my network abstraction. So I pick the proper network, logical networks that I'm going to need for this cloud to do the network virtualization that it needs. And that way I can create those VM networks on top of there. Then lastly, I'm going to choose which tiers of storage or which classifications of storage are available to this cloud. Now, I may have different needs for a production cloud than I do for a development cloud. My production cloud may need that high I/O type storage, or may need access to all different types of storage. So I can give it access to all of those. Or maybe my development cloud, I don't want them deploying on my very expensive storage. So maybe I'll just give them the low IOPS storage that I have there. And that's all they'll need for the development environment, say. So I can choose which clouds have which storage available, which will allow me to then specify which physical or which types of virtual machines that I can deploy inside of those clouds. The next thing about clouds are they give me not only the ability to use the underlying physical resources, but to set limits on the amount of resources that any individual cloud can use. I may have a ton of storage attached to the Hyper-V host that this cloud is getting resources from. Maybe I got 50 terabytes of storage, but I only want this cloud to be able to access at a maximum 4 terabytes or something like that. I can specify here limits around the amount of physical resources that are consumed by this cloud. And this is the first place I can set this type of quota. And I'll tell you about some other places later on in the talk today. The other thing is that this is not a hard limit in that it's not a static limit, I should say. I can dynamically adjust this limit as my needs change. So maybe I'm running and I only want 250 virtual machines to be deployed today, but I've added now 10 more Hyper-V hosts and can support hundreds to thousands more virtual machines. So let me up that number from 250 to say 1,000 or something like that, where over time I may want to make those types of changes. And that's the nice thing about clouds, is that they're able to give you that dynamic flexibility where I can set those caps and then I can adjust them as needed. I can over allocate, as we talked about earlier, and I can fully utilize the resources that I have available to me. Then lastly, I want to control the types of virtual machines that I can deploy on these clouds. Now, I have different ways of creating these, what we call virtual machine capability profiles. I can use the included ones, which are basically ones for Hyper-V, VMware, or Citrix. And they would just basically say any type of virtual machine like this I can deploy. But the fact is that I may want to create different tiers of cloud storage, of virtual machines that can be deployed. Maybe I create a gold tier, which has the ability to deploy on 64 virtual CPUs and up to 4 terabytes of storage, and maybe a terabyte of RAM or something like that. Then I may want to create a silver capability profile, which says only up to 8 virtual CPUs and only up to 64 gigs of RAM or something like that. Maybe a bronze or whatever, or copper type storage virtual machine. And then I can choose which virtual machines get assigned to which clouds. And this allows me again to have control as an administrator over the types of resources and the types of virtual machines that a user can deploy on these different clouds. So I can set constraints and limits around the VMs that are going to be created by using this capability profile. And then I can attach these different capability profiles to specific clouds to control who has access to which virtual machines and which ones they can deploy. So when I create this cloud environment, I now have the ability to allocate these resources to what we call tenants. And a tenant would be someone who is going to just use the cloud resources. They're not going to be an administrator, but instead what they're really going to be able to do is just simply see a pool of resources and deploy access and deploy capabilities to those resources. So with VMM and System Center 2012 R2, in SP1 we added this role-based administration with these different tenants, and we've really enhanced what they can do inside of R2. So we have this thing called a read-only administrator, and that's someone that you assign to a specific cloud or a specific set of hosts or the entire data center that basically can just see what's going on. And that's great for help desk people that, they get a call, the server's down, they can go check without having to actually have any type of control into those physical resources. We then have a self-service user. And a self-service user is one that is usually the application owner or the person who is going to be deploying virtual machines. They have a scope that's specified at a cloud level, so they can have access to 1, 2, or more clouds, and they have the ability to create templates of virtual machines, deploy and manage those VMs, share resources between different libraries and that type of thing, but you have the ability to assign them specific set and level of permissions. Now we've made some changes here with R2, which I'll talk about in a few slides, but the self-service user is basically who's going to be doing that virtual machine deployment and configuration. And in a multi-tenant environment, I will probably have a tenant administrator as well. Think of a tenant administrator as someone who is basically created is the guy who's buying the resources from let's say, a service provider. So, I'm an administrator, I'm going to buy resources from this service provider, then I want to create different users that can deploy those virtual machines that I've given them access to. So I, as a tenant administrator, would then not only be able to create and deploy virtual machines, but also be able to allocate and sub-allocate my given resources to these other different tenants or the self-service users. So this gives me the ability also to do things like create the VM networks and do the networking scheme, manage the environment, that then I can give access to all these different self-service users that are out there. Then we move from the people that have just only cloud access to people that have access to the underlying physical resources. And the first user we have there is a delegated administrator. And that guy has access not only to be able to deploy virtual machines and those types of things, everything that a tenant administrator and a self-service user can do, but also has physical device capabilities of management. In other words, I can go to the Hyper-V host that this cloud that's servicing the resources for this cloud, and I can make changes there. I can do things with storage, like allocate storage and things like that. I can create clouds and I can assign clouds to different people. So I have access to specific pieces of fabric, and then that fabric can be allocated to the tenant administrators or to self-service users. And then obviously there's an all-up VMM administrator who has full access to everything. And that is a person who can do everything that all these other guys can do, but can do it for the entire system. So I'm not limited by just this host group or just this piece of storage, but instead I have full access to everything inside of there. Now within the self-service user, we have the ability to assign actions to this user role. In other words, I have the ability to give it certain capabilities. And this is where I can limit things. If I have a user that all I want them to be able to do is start and stop VMs, I can do that. I can just click start, stop VMs. I can do that for, I can give him the ability to create virtual machine templates or just use an existing template that I've created and they can just deploy virtual machines from there. What we added in R2 today, our System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2012 R2, is the ability to now create these custom assigned actions at a per cloud basis. What this means now is that I can set some global permissions like start and stop VM. For production, maybe I want them to also be able to pause a VM. But in development, I want to give them the ability to deploy new virtual machines. So I can create these different levels on a per cloud basis. Before, with SP1 and before, I would have to create different user roles per cloud to get that functionality. Now I've pulled that all together. And I can choose these actions and I can change them. I can give them the ability to do things like create actions, like create a deploy template. And then after they've deployed the templates that they want to deploy, I can pull that access away from them and only give them the ability to just start and stop VMs. And the nice thing is we use Active Directory users and groups for this. And if this is a company that's not in my environment or in my domain, you know, I'm a service provider and this is another company that's outside my domain, I can work on behalf of that user. And so I can set up connectivity and say, well, if he's going to be running here, then he's going to be doing it on behalf of this user. And so I can set up this multi-tenant environment where they don't have to be a part of my domain, but I can still give them access to start VMs, stop VMs, create, deploy, that type of thing. The other thing I can do is I can assign a quota capacity per cloud. So we talked about quota capacity at the onset, where I was able to create for the cloud, set specific quota limitations. Well, at a user role level, I can also set that quota capacity. So I have the ability to set the quota level to all members within a group. So I create this user role, this tenant self-service user. And at that user role, I can say, okay, you can set 100 virtual CPUs and 50 virtual machines, even though for the cloud, it's unlimited virtual CPUs and it's 400 virtual machines. I can also set that level at the individual member level. So any individual member can only deploy up to 10 virtual machines. Now this is important. Let's say I have a development environment, and inside that development environment, I have 20 members of this group. And each person needs to deploy a service that takes up 5 virtual machines. Well, in this environment, that would mean that for the group where I have specified 50 virtual machines, I can deploy up to 10 of these services at any one time. So I'm not going to overload my system. The first guy deploys one service template, he gets 5 VMs. The second guy, 5 VMs. Third, all the way up to 10, that's your 50 VMs. That 11th guy wants to deploy a service, it can't because they've run out of quota. And they can work on that quota, so I'm going to protect my cloud so it's not going to run out of resources while these users are deploying their development environment. But I don't want any one user to co-opt the entire pool of resources that I've assigned to this group. So I'm going to limit that to 10 in this environment here. So that means any one particular user can deploy 2 instances of this service, 5 VMs the first time, 5 VMs the second time. But they're never going to be able to deploy all 50 so that other people will be able to use these resources as well. So this example right here is, I have a 50 VM limit for all members of the user role, and then a 10 VM limit per individual member. Allows me as an administrator to protect and control my environment, but give the flexibility for those self-service users to deploy and remove and store or whatever they need to do to get their work done without having to get me involved. But I have protection as to how much of the resources they're going to take so that I know my other cloud users are going to be protected inside of there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to flip over to the demo and take a quick look at how this is going to look for a customer in the environment. All right, so we're in the demo environment here, and as you can see in the VMs and Services workspace, we have a couple of clouds that are already created. We have a production cloud and a development cloud. And like we saw inside of the presentation, if we look at the properties of a cloud, we can see the resources that we're going to use. We can see the logical networks that are going to be available to this cloud. We can also see things like the storage classifications, as well as the port classifications for the networking protocols. And you can also see the capacity limitations and the quota environments and whatever we have set there. Because this is production, I want everybody to have access to all the resources. In my development environment, for maybe the same set of resources, I might want to limit the amount of resources that they have. But the other thing that we have is we have those tenants, and the tenants are the ones that have access to deploy resources or deploy VMs and services on this pool of resources. And if I look at these HR users properties here, what we can see is that there are a couple of important pieces to note here. The members, this is where I get the information from Active Directory, and it's either going to be a direct Active Directory or it's going to be basically someone that's working on behalf of for a person that's outside my organization. We set the scope, and this is which clouds we have access to, and depending on the scope will depend on what permissions they have. We have quotas for each of those clouds, so in the development environment I have that 50-10 set up inside of there, and in production I'll let this guy deploy all the resources that he wants and needs because of the production environment. I can set the limitations however I want on a per cloud basis, but then the last thing that's important here is the permissions. And this is where I can specify at a global level. So at a global level, no matter what, they have start and stop. But inside development, I want to give them full access to everything. But in production, I only want to give them limited access. The start and stop they have, but also give them pause and resume. So this is new with R2. In R2, in SP1, like I said, you had to create different user rules for each of them. But in R2, we have the ability now to specify different types of activities per cloud that you have access to. All right, now we're going to flip back to the presentation. Inside of the cloud environment, we talked about how to create those clouds as well as how to not only create them, but create the user roles on top of the clouds and what each of the different user roles mean, whether it's a delegated user role, delegated admin, or it is a it's the tenant administrator, or it's just a regular user. Well, the thing is that while we're running within this cloud, we also need to be able to report on how these clouds are functioning and whether we're getting the nice resources and access to resources that we need. So what we've also done, and we're going to talk about in this area of creating the clouds, is now that I have these clouds created, I need to report on how these resources are being used, and after they are being used, I need to understand what types of things, like, am I running out of resources, and if I am, when am I going to run out of those resources? So our customers tell us, they need to know the utilization of their private cloud infrastructure, and they need to know how it's being used right now. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, am I really fully utilizing this set of resources? Am I cyclical? Does it really busy in the morning? Whatever. I need to trend this private cloud infrastructure usage over time. Is the first of the month always really busy, or is it the end of the month? Is it the end of the quarter? That type of thing. And because of this, I need to be able to forecast to the future what's going to happen. If I'm growing at 3% utilization every month, when am I going to hit that 70% threshold and want to buy more resources to add into this cloud services? So I need to know these types of information. And with capacity reporting, with our connections with Operations Manager, I can use a familiar tool to do this type of reporting. So with private cloud usage reporting, when I connect Operations Manager with Virtual Machine Manager, those two components of System Center, I can do this type of reporting. We push all that information into Operations Manager, and it can pull that information and report upon it for us through the reporting capabilities inside of the Operations Manager console. Now, if I want to just do what's happening with this cloud over the past 10 days or since the first day of the quarter, I can choose the date range that I want to report against. I can choose which hosts. Now those are all the hosts that VMM is managing, whether it's Hyper-V hosts or ESX hosts or Citrix Zen server hosts. And I can pick the host that I want to manage, and then it can run the report and view the results. And I can see here that I'm not really maxing out all the different resources that I have available to me, but I have this now way of generating and gathering that report. The other thing I may need to do is determine, am I going to run out of resources? So basically, I want to monitor the usage over time and forecast out a few cycles to see when I'm going to start hitting those thresholds that I have. And so through our integration with Operations Manager and the SQL Server Analysis Services capabilities inside a SQL Server, we can monitor the usage over time. So we basically take 10 units, maybe 10 days, 10 weeks, 10 months, and we can forecast out 3 units. So if I take the last 10 weeks, I can forecast out the next 3 weeks and determine my changes in utilization. And this helps me for determining what-if scenarios. If I'm trending up as far as utilization and hitting that 60-70% threshold, I'll know when I'm going to hit that 80-90%, or at least have a good guess to it. And that allows me to preemptively purchase capacity to expand my resources so I don't ever hit that 80, 90, 100% utilization and run out of those resources. So when we look at that, SQL Server Analysis Services looks at the trend in the resources, and it will give me a range through certain standard deviations and such as to what it thinks is going to be used over a specific amount of time. So we talked about creating clouds, we talked about allocating those cloud resources, we talked about reporting on those clouds. Well, I have this cloud internally, but what if I want to move across to other clouds? I want to talk about how can I take resources that I have here and leverage a service provider that might be out there? Or how do I utilize resources at a service provider from within my organization? And I can do this through this consistent view of my different cloud environments, whether it's my on-premises private cloud, whether it's my public cloud with Windows Azure, or it's my service provider cloud. So what this means is that I can use App Controller within System Center 2012 R2, and I can view and access resources on my internal private cloud. It can be my consumption model for using the resources that are allocated to me. I can also connect to a service provider via App Controller and be able to deploy resources up there in my tenant clouds that they've given me access to. And I can use App Controller to deploy services up in Windows Azure via virtual machines inside of Windows Azure or not. So App Controller is a way for me to do this. What this means is, take an example of a company where they have an on-premises financial application. It has a couple of SQL servers right in the back end that's clustered and virtualized. It has an application server, and it has a few web servers. It may have a bunch of other servers or services running within their environment, but now they were running all of this on-premises, and we want to start moving this to an external environment. Well, first of all, one thing I may want to do is I may want to put pieces of this application on each of these different clouds. So on my on-premises cloud, maybe I want to keep my SQL environment there because I have restrictions or governances across where my data sovereignty is and my data is located. And I've got to keep that on-premise for compliance issues. But my SQL needs more resources. So I can take those SQL servers and I can dynamically expand the resources that they use on the fly using the new tools like Windows Server 2012 and R2 has the ability to dynamically expand the memory capacity with dynamic memory while the VM's still up and running. And VMM can take advantage of that now. So I can expand the resources allocated to that SQL server on premises. I can take that app server and move it over to my service provider. So maybe the app server is running locally. I can take that virtual machine, I can export it, I can copy the VHD up to my service provider, and then I can deploy it up there on my service provider. Because of the VM networks and everything, I can still access between my SQL Server environment and my app server there. Then lastly, I want to take that web server front end, and I want to be able to push it up to my Windows Azure. I want to, instead of hosting it locally, because it needs to be able to expand and contract as the resources are needed, when peak times happen and when they don't, I just want to put that up inside of Windows Azure, inside of the Microsoft Cloud, and still be able to access all of these different resources across all these different locations, and do that all still monitored via System Center with Operations Manager, still being able to have all of these different pieces talk to each other, but now leverage the correct cloud for the correct set of resources. So we can now allow you, with some of the technology that we've come out with System Center 2012 SP1 and now with Windows Azure Pack in R2, to treat our infrastructure like a service provider cloud. You can configure your underlying fabric, you can create a cloud from that fabric, you can delegate that cloud to your self-service users, and have them deploy virtual machines just like a service provider might do. So what this means is that I can make plans and offerings. I can make custom packaged services that I can offer to my different business units. They can then purchase those. They can sign up for them, whatever, however you want to do that, if you want to do chargeback or not. And I can give them the ability to create their VMs, create their VM networks, hook it up to their physical infrastructure, and treat my underlying back-end infrastructure like a service provider would. And for a lot of organizations, they want to move to that way of doing it. And to do that, they may not do it for all of their resources. They may have a lot of servers that are still managed traditionally, using System Center and everything like that, but they may have another group that they want to manage via the Windows Azure pack, which leverages the Service Provider Foundation. And what this allows me to do is, as a service provider or as a enterprise that wants to treat myself as a service provider, it allows me to create a packaged set of service offerings that I can pass up to my different business units, whether it be websites, whether it be virtual machines, whether it be VM networks and whatever, service bus or whatever, that allows me to treat this pool of servers and this pool of physical resources like a service provider would. And Service Provider Foundation is the connection into System Center that allows me to do that for my compute storage and networking resources for virtual machines. So Service Provider Foundation is a REST-based OData API that allows me to, either using the Windows Azure pack or creating my own custom front end, talk to the underlying System Center environment in a consistent way, whether it be one set of system servers, or if I have many physical servers, I might have multiple different stamps of these servers that I deploy. It provides a multi-tenant isolation, meaning that I may have two different tenants that need access to the same physical underside set of resources, but across all these different stamps of servers, I can create this isolation between them and deploy the virtual machines where they need to be deployed and take advantage of my physical resources, giving the customers the ability, their tenants, the ability to create the virtual machines that they need through the quotas that I've given them access to. And this provides a benefit in that it also allows me to create that networking connection between the tenant data center. So if I'm a service provider, my tenants have their totally data centers in totally different environments, or as a networked environment in my own enterprise, the ability for the different tenants to be able to access their physical resources and connect them with the virtualized resources that I'm providing to them through the Windows Azure pack. So here, what I would do is I would create, in this environment here, I would create a connection between an offering for the tenant to sign up for. And when they sign up for that offering, part of the capability is to set up the networking capability between my internal virtualized network environment and their physical network. Is it going to use the site-to-site VPN gateway? Is it going to use NAT or whatever? So they can now configure that themselves. And through the Windows Azure pack, it'll configure it via VMM and set up the gateway environment. And once it's done all that, then a user now has a site-to-site network connection between their tenant VMs inside of my infrastructure and their physical infrastructure that they have, which means that virtual machines now can route packets into and out of the virtualized environment to that physical environment in a totally isolated and protected way, using all the stuff that we talked about in that first video under network virtualization. So when you put all of this stuff together, what we've talked about in this video is we've talked about how to create clouds, how we can create multi-tenant management of those clouds, and how the multiple tenants can have different capabilities and activities within each of those different clouds. That way they can stop VMs in a production cloud, but they can all have full control inside of a network cloud. And then we pull them all together and show you how to manage across the different cloud environments. So what we've really focused on in this session is taking that physical infrastructure and building the cloud infrastructure on top of it. And once we build that cloud infrastructure on top of it, how to handle it in a multi-tenant environment. And now with the next set of videos, we're going to talk about the day-to-day operations and how once these things in clouds are created and people are using them, they can then go off and make sure that it's running and functioning correctly.